What if the most beloved faces of British TV were hiding the darkest secrets? Behind the laughter, the charm, and the Saturday night smiles, there was something else, something festering. This isn't about cancel culture. It's about what was always there, but no one dared say out loud. These aren't rumors, whispered in green rooms. These are stories etched in court records, biographies, and open verdicts. Welcome to the other side of fame, where the applause fades, and the truth refuses to. These are the 17 most disgusting old British star rumors that turned out to be totally true. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button if you're into the kind of stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about fame. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you winding down late at night, or just starting your day with something unsettling? Either way, you're in for a ride. 1. Jimmy Savile. For decades, Jimmy Savile was Britain's most famous eccentric. He was the ghost in a tracksuit, the man with a cigar for a conscience, and a Rolodex of royal contacts. He raised millions for hospitals, and called himself a listener of people, and people believed him, not because they trusted him, necessarily, but because they couldn't imagine the alternative. Savile was everywhere on TV, in hospitals, backstage, behind closed doors. That last one mattered. He had a knack for being just visible enough to be trusted, and just creepy enough to be ignored. The public wrote him off as a bit weird. The BBC wrote him checks, and institutions, hospitals, children's homes, broadcasters handed him keys. After his death in 2011, the facade cracked open. What emerged wasn't just disturbing, it was systemic. Hundreds of allegations spanning decades, age groups, and institutions. Investigations unearthed patterns that suggested not one man's depravity, but a society's refusal to look too closely at its idols. Why didn't they see it? They did. They just didn't want to be the first to say it out loud, because to say it meant you'd never watch Jim'll Fix It the same way again. Meant your childhood was touched by something darker than nostalgia, so silence was safer. Today, Savile isn't just a case study in monstrous behavior. He's shorthand for how far celebrity immunity can stretch before it snaps. And even then, it only snapped when he was no longer alive to sue. Of course, he wasn't the only one. And once that dam broke, it was only a matter of time before the trickle became a landslide and another familiar face slid out of the shadows. 2. Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall had a laugh like polished brass and the kind of face that comforted post-war Britain. He was television's uncle, the jolly host of It's a Knockout, a children's presenter, a trusted voice on national airwaves. In other words, perfectly placed. His public image was harmless, farcical even. He bumbled, he beamed. Meanwhile, the system around him, TV networks, institutions, gatekeepers, did the one thing predators dream of. They confused likability with safety. Hall was convicted in 2013 for indecent assaults on multiple underage girls, many dating back to the 1970s. These weren't whispers. They were buried testimonies, made irrelevant by the sheer gravitational pull of Hall's celebrity. His victims spoke of assaults that happened in dressing rooms, backstage corridors, offices, spaces where fame created a force field, and everyone else was told to smile for the camera. In court, he pled guilty, but in public, he'd spent decades wearing a mask that made the truth not just unbelievable, but inconvenient. If people believed Hall was capable of that, what else might they have missed? The answer was obvious. They missed a lot. They missed everything. The revelations about Hall didn't just shatter his image. They helped redefine an entire era of British broadcasting as dangerously naive. He wasn't an outlier. He was a blueprint. And when paired with Savile's legacy, Hall's downfall confirmed something nobody wanted to say out loud, that there were networks, literal and figurative, that protected predators as long as they kept the audience entertained. But if Hall was the smiling uncle, the next man was the smooth-talking radio king, and behind that radio voice, something far less charming. 2 names in, and already the surface is cracking. If you're still with us, you know this isn't just scandal, it's a system unraveling. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it as you listen to this? Are you watching in the dead of night? Or letting these shadows in with your morning coffee? 3. Dave Lee Travis. Dave Lee Travis made his name spinning records and cracking jokes in a voice as smooth as custard. He was a staple of 1970s and 80 seconds, British radio, one of those BBC men with a grin you could hear. The Hairy Cornflake, they called him, as if absurd nicknames made people harmless. The illusion worked for a while. Then the culture shifted, the floodgates opened, and suddenly, old jokes weren't funny anymore. In 2014, Travis was convicted of indecent assault. Not a sweeping downfall like Savile, but not a footnote either. Just one count, amid many accusations. The legal system cleared him of some charges, but one stuck and the tone of the press shifted overnight. This wasn't just another DJ from the golden age of British radio. This was another man from the Savile-era club whose backstage behavior didn't match his on-air persona. What made it stick wasn't just the verdict. It was the context. Travis had come up in the same industry that now looked like a boys' club, wrapped in cables and plausible deniability. His defense leaned hard on nostalgia. But nostalgia, it turned out, had expired. So had the belief that certain people were just being cheeky. His one conviction became a symbol, that even a single proven account was enough to turn the tide, that no number of jingles or throwback montages could restore what was lost. And what was lost? Exactly. The idea that fame was ever proof of character. But the line between pop culture and criminality wasn't always criminal court sharp. Sometimes it blurred into something more elusive, more slippery. A teenage heartthrob, a primetime actor, handsome, wholesome, and hiding something older than his boyish smile. 4. John Alford. John Alford had the kind of face that got cast in school dramas and firefighter shows. A rising star of the late 80 seconds and 90 seconds, he made his name playing earnest roles, troubled teens, brave young men, the kind you rooted for. Off-screen, he was marketed as a teenage dream. The magazines called him the next big thing. The law eventually called him something else. In 2025, Alford was convicted of sexually assaulting teenage girls' allegations dating back to his peak years on British TV. The news landed like a punchline without a setup. Many had forgotten him. But those who remembered him fondly. That's how the machinery worked. Package the fame, bury the fallout. What distinguished Alford's case wasn't just that it happened, but that it took so long to reach court. The incidents belonged to a different era, one where teen fan culture was booming, and the lines between access and exploitation were deliberately fuzzy. The backstage world of youth-oriented television was a playground without supervision. And those who tried to speak up found themselves facing not just disbelief, but disdain. The trial revealed what survivors had known for decades, that silence wasn't just common, it was engineered. The victims weren't protected, the fame was. Alford's conviction didn't cause as big a media storm as others, but it mattered. It marked the expanding timeline of justice, the idea that what happened in the glossy VHS era could still be dragged into the glare of today's courtrooms. And if the era of teen idols was capable of producing that kind of rot under the surface, what about the ones who weren't just on screen but behind the scenes? Not heartthrobs, not even actors. Just the clever ones, the writers, the thinkers, the ones you hoped were better. 5. Chris Langham. Chris Langham wasn't built like a leading man, but he didn't need to be. He was the clever one, the satirist, the writer, the eccentric genius behind the curtain. In an industry that lionized charisma, Langham built a brand out of self-deprecation. He wrote for comedy legends, won awards, played awkward roles that made awkward people feel seen. He was a man you underestimated by design. And then came the conviction. In 2007, Langham was found guilty of possessing child abuse imagery. The trial didn't just end his career, it detonated it. His defense tried to intellectualize the crime, arguing that it was research for a role. The court didn't buy it, nor did the public. For someone who built his name on social satire, the irony was brutal. Langham's downfall didn't fit neatly into the tabloid template. He wasn't part of the loud, crude, showbiz crowd. He was cerebral, subtle. The kind of figure people instinctively trust more, because they seem uncomfortable with power. But here, that discomfort became camouflage. And when it slipped, it was hard to unsee what had been hiding behind the clever lines and awkward charm. Post-trial, Langham all but vanished. His past work became radioactive. Retrospectives blurred his name. And yet, the case remains a keystone in the public's shifting understanding of fame. That danger doesn't always come in leering, cartoonish forms. Sometimes, it arrives dressed in irony, armed with self-awareness, and wearing the quiet respectability of a BAFTA. And if a soft-spoken writer could be guilty, what about the ones with louder reputations, the ones who already had criminal pasts, just not the kind the industry liked to talk about? Because sometimes, when the curtain rises, it reveals not just performance but blood. 6. Leslie Grantham. Leslie Grantham had a face made for villainy. You didn't need to know his name, you just needed to see him squint, and you'd recognize Dirty Den from EastEnders, the charming bastard who could smile while ruining lives. In Soapland, he was iconic. In real life, he was something else entirely. Before he ever set foot on a TV set, Grantham had already served time for murder. A botched robbery in Germany while serving in the army ended with a taxi driver dead. Grantham was caught, convicted, and imprisoned. It's the kind of backstory that usually ends a life, not launches a second act. But television, it turns out, has a remarkable talent for recycling damaged goods when the ratings are right. By the 1980s, Grantham was a household name, a convicted killer turned TV legend, and for a while, the public narrative clung to redemption. He'd paid his dues. He was reformed. Britain loves a comeback story, especially if it comes with tabloid heat and a catchy theme tune. But the shine wore off. In the early 2000s, Grantham was engulfed in a sex scandal that abruptly ended his career. The details were tawdry, the press coverage gleeful, and whatever goodwill he'd built up began to rot. He faded from screens, a ghost of his former notoriety. Still, his story lingers not because of the scandal, but because of what it says about celebrity reinvention. A convicted murderer became a soap icon, not in spite of his past, but because the industry bet that the public would forget. And for a while, it worked. But not every public figure gets to vanish when the lights go out. Some stay in the headlines for reasons far stranger, far more unresolved where the crime is obvious, but the culprit is not. 7. Michael Barrymore. Michael Barrymore was once ITV's crown jewel, Britain's golden boy of light entertainment. He danced, he cracked jokes, he gave off the manic energy of a man whose life depended on your laughter. For years, it worked. Barrymore wasn't just famous, he was adored, the kind of Saturday night safe you could trust with the whole family. Then came the night in 2001 when Stuart Lubbock was found dead in Barrymore's pool after a party at his home. It didn't take long for the media to pounce, not just because someone had died, but because of how. The coroner returned an open verdict, a phrase that somehow sounded both evasive and damning. There were injuries, there were substances. There were a dozen unanswered questions, and Barrymore had no good answers, just a crumbling public image and a lawyer on speed dial. Legally, Barrymore was never charged with causing Lubbock's death. He has always denied involvement, but that didn't stop the speculation or the long shadow the case cast over his career. He went from a national treasure to a cautionary tale in real time. A man who once seemed to exist purely to entertain now looked like someone dodging cameras for entirely different reasons. The inquest didn't convict him, but it didn't clear him either. And that ambiguity, never quite guilty, never quite innocent, proved more corrosive than certainty ever could. Barrymore's story lives in the liminal space between crime and scandal, where nothing is technically proven, but nothing can be forgotten. It's a vacuum of resolution that still hums with discomfort. And if the Barrymore case unsettled people with its unknowns, the next figure made people squirm for an entirely different reason. A courtroom loss, a denial that didn't hold, and a judgment that said more than it seemed. 8. Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr was British TV's answer to chaos. Wild-eyed, loud, and perpetually unfiltered. He was the kind of comedian who seemed like he might explode mid-sentence, equal parts energy and danger. A human punchline with a questionable punch. His style was vintage variety, slapstick, surreal, and just crude enough to make you question your taste. But behind the slapstick persona, Starr's name would eventually become tied to something darker, allegations that, for years, existed only in whispered anecdotes and tabloid teases. That changed in 2015, when he sued a woman who had accused him of groping her when she was a teenager. Starr denied everything. He took the case to court. He lost. The High Court judgment didn't find him criminally guilty. That wasn't the kind of case it was. But it ruled that the woman's account wasn't defamatory. Translation: the court didn't accept Starr's version as the truth. It didn't believe his denial. That legal nuance may have confused the public, but to anyone reading between the lines, the message was clear. What made Starr's case different was its legal shape. It wasn't about a criminal conviction. It was about reputation, and how, sometimes, trying to defend it only confirms the thing you wanted to erase. The court loss didn't send Starr to prison, but it did redraw the public record in permanent ink. In his final years, Starr's career had already faded. The verdict sealed the exit. His brand of comedy, once dismissed as naughty but harmless, now looked like a smokescreen for something far more troubling. The laughter, in retrospect, felt like a distraction. And if Starr represented the dangerous elasticity of public forgiveness, the next man on the list proved that for some, there was no forgiveness at all, even if the crime had nothing to do with comedy, or fans, or the stage. 9. Peter Wyngarde. Peter Wyngarde was television's most elegant enigma, a man whose mustache arrived 5 minutes before he did, whose velvet voice could sell anything from spy fiction to surreal dreamscapes. In the 1960s and 70 seconds, he was the very image of camp sophistication, the original Jason King, dripping with charisma and cheekbones. His characters oozed charm. His real life, however, told a much less polished story. In 1975, Wyngarde was convicted of gross indecency in a public toilet, a term that, in the language of the time, meant homosexuality criminalized under outdated laws. He was fined, quietly, discreetly, then shuffled out of sight, though not entirely out of work. The conviction didn't destroy his career, it just redefined its ceiling. Wyngarde's scandal was peculiar by modern standards. There was no predatory narrative, no moral panic, no grand revelation of systemic abuse. Instead, there was shame, the old-fashioned kind. A private act turned public disgrace in a society still unsure whether it wanted its idols to be human or simply to behave. What followed was a slow fade. Wyngarde's fame didn't collapse, it eroded, bit by bit, through fewer roles, cautious interviews, and an increasingly hazy public image. He became one of those celebrities people remembered vaguely, as if through a dream tinted by cigarette smoke and moral ambiguity. Today, his conviction is less a scandal than a case study in the double standards of fame and morality, a reminder of how British society criminalized the private lives of public figures until it didn't. And yet, even when the laws changed, the damage lingered. The silences stayed silent. Wyngarde's story is a relic of another time. But the next name on the list proved that even the highest institutions, knighthoods, theater royalty, the very top of the cultural food chain, weren't immune to public disgrace. 10. Sir John Gielgud. Sir John Gielgud was theater aristocracy, an actor so revered, even Shakespeare might have blushed. He played kings, prophets, ghost-haunted fathers. He was knighted for his contributions to drama, adored by critics, and whispered about with the kind of reverence reserved for ancient monuments and endangered species. In short, untouchable. Until 1953, when the police caught him in a public lavatory and charged him with importuning, a criminal offense at the time, aimed squarely at gay men navigating a world that refused to name them. Gielgud pleaded guilty, was fined, and tried to retreat into obscurity. Instead, he returned to the stage and to public favor with an almost unsettling speed. His fans, famously, gave him a standing ovation on his next appearance. A sign, perhaps, that even in mid-century Britain, there were limits to moral outrage. Or maybe just that audiences can forgive anything if it doesn't inconvenience their evening entertainment. The Gielgud incident is uncomfortable to classify. it's not disgusting in the modern moral sense, more a symptom of a society that punished identity with legal force. Yet it still belongs on this list, not because of what he did, but because of what happened next. The rapid restoration of status, the polite forgetfulness of institutions, and the quiet rewriting of the public record. Gielgud remained a fixture of British culture until his death in 2000. He outlived the laws that once criminalized him. But the conviction remained a shadow, quietly ignored by obituaries too focused on greatness to dwell on human contradictions. And if Gielgud's scandal was a product of repression, the next case proves that some reputations were maintained not through silence, but through sheer discomfort, institutional blind spots, and a cultural refusal to look too hard at its own dirt. 11. Wilfrid Brambell. Wilfrid Brambell was the original dirty old man. Literally, that was his character on Steptoe and Son, a bitter, conniving junk dealer, forever feuding with his son in one of Britain's most iconic sitcoms. Off-screen, Brambell was a different kind of private, polite, elusive, and meticulous. He kept his real life sealed tight behind a facade of eccentric professionalism. And for decades, that privacy was accepted without question. But Brambell wasn't just acting in his role as a crusty, closeted loner. In 1962, he was convicted of importuning caught soliciting in a public toilet, a charge that mirrored the legal traps laid for many gay men at the time. The news made headlines but didn't end his career. The BBC and public alike seemed willing to pretend it never happened, so long as the laughs kept coming. Later years saw something murkier begin to circulate claims of other behavior, darker and less legally clear. Allegations about abuse emerged, mostly second-hand, often poorly sourced. They never rose to the level of official inquiry or formal charges. Still, they clung to his legacy like static, whispered, unverified, persistent. It's this duality that makes Brambell so unsettling in hindsight. The confirmed conviction tells one story of a man trapped by laws designed to humiliate. The unconfirmed rumors tell another of how that shame sometimes obscured deeper scrutiny. What's fair to say is this: he operated in a time when privacy wasn't just respected, it was weaponized. Brambell died in 1985, before the media could decide how to reframe him, which means he remains frozen in ambiguity, a cautionary tale without closure. But where his contradictions were tangled in secrecy, the next entry is flamboyantly open, a woman whose public persona screamed glamour while her private life was playing by very different rules. 12. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe, if Monroe had grown up tougher, talked faster, and understood exactly how to weaponize male attention. She was a bombshell, a pin-up, a blonde cyclone of charm and controversy. But unlike her Hollywood counterparts, Dors didn't just play the fame game, she gamed it. Throughout the 1950s and 60 seconds, Dors leaned into the image that the tabloids carved for her. A party girl, a sex symbol, a woman with more scandal than screen time. But behind the stardust and headlines was a story that aged poorly. Biographers and journalists would later describe her life as one riddled with exploitation, drug-fueled adult parties, where consent blurred into currency, where young women became decoration, and where Dors herself may have been both victim and enabler in a system designed to devour beauty for profit. These weren't one-off allegations. The stories have been told repeatedly, sometimes with sources, sometimes as open secrets passed around the industry like old scripts. The culture around her wasn't just permissive, it was built on the normalization of excess and predation. And Dors, for all her wit and resilience, became a tragic emblem of how star power could be used to obscure exploitation rather than escape it. Her later years were quieter, tinged with financial troubles and shifting public taste. But even as the spotlight dimmed, the mythology grew. She was glamorous, she was dangerous. She knew too much and said too little. Today, Dors is often remembered with a kind of melancholic admiration, the woman who had everything, except protection, who sold sex like it was armor, only to discover it was paper thin. And if her life showed the costs of being objectified, the next story shows the costs of being branded cheeky, while no one asked what the price really was. 13. Barbara Windsor. Barbara Windsor was packaged as Britain's giggle, the wide-eyed blonde with the breathy laugh, the cheeky grin, the national treasure of innuendo. In the Carry On films, she wasn't just a performer, she was a cultural product. The camera adored her, the public adored her, the industry consumed her. For decades, Windsor's fame was built on a very specific bargain. She would be the country's lovable fantasy, and in return, she would be rewarded with applause, attention, and the illusion of safety. But behind the saucy sweetheart image was something far less playful. In her memoir and biographies, Windsor described experiences that were not glamorous at all, relationships marked by manipulation and documented physical abuse, moments where the laughter stopped backstage. The public saw a woman playing the joke. Privately, she was often the one being played. That's the uncomfortable truth about the era that made her famous. Sex comedy was treated like harmless fun, while the women inside it were expected to tolerate whatever came with the role. Discomfort was dismissed as prudishness. Harm was rebranded as gossip, and Windsor, for years, carried the weight of being adored in a way that didn't always feel like love. Modern reassessments of her life tend to feel almost apologetic, not because she wasn't brilliant, she was, but because the culture that celebrated her also normalized the conditions that hurt her. She became emblematic of an industry where women were marketed as jokes and then left alone with the consequences. Barbara Windsor's story isn't about scandal in the traditional sense. It's about the quiet damage of being turned into a symbol, and how even cheeky fame can leave bruises no audience ever sees. And if Windsor's pain was hidden behind laughter, the next name reveals what happens when the mask isn't a smile, but genius. 14. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a man of 1,000 faces, and none of them seemed to belong to him. He could be Clouseau, Strangelove, Chance the Gardener, characters so vivid they swallowed the screen whole. The public called him a comedic master. The industry called him indispensable. The people closest to him often called him something else entirely. Biographers have painted Sellers as brilliant, yes, but also volatile, cruel, and emotionally destructive. Stories repeat with grim consistency. Partners demeaned, children wounded by absence or harshness, friendships strained under the weight of his moods. His talent was enormous, but so was the collateral damage. And the most unsettling part is how familiar the excuse sounds. The difficult genius, the temperamental artist, the idea that greatness comes with a license to hurt people, as if cruelty is just part of the contract. Sellers lived inside contradiction. On screen, he was laughter incarnate. Off screen, he could be cold, punishing, and impossible to live with. Those who loved him often described him as someone who seemed to vanish the moment the cameras stopped rolling, leaving only insecurity and rage in his place. In his era, this behavior was often tolerated, even romanticized. Studios needed him. Directors feared him. The myth of genius protected him better than any publicist ever could. Today, the conversation is harsher not because the work matters less, but because the harm can no longer be waved away as eccentricity. Peter Sellers remains one of the clearest examples of an uncomfortable question. How much cruelty will the world forgive if the punchlines are good enough? And if Sellers shows the private darkness behind comedy's brightest stars, the next man proves that sometimes the darkness wasn't hidden at all. It was staggering through pubs, swinging fists, and being marketed as charm. 15. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed was the walking embodiment of the phrase, larger than life, and frequently louder, a swaggering brute of a man with the face of a Byronic villain and the liver of a professional daredevil. To the public, he was an actor, a drinker, a talk show time bomb. He could go from Shakespeare to bar fight in under a minute, and audiences never quite knew which version they'd get. His film work ranged from poetic to primal, but Reed's off-screen persona often stole the spotlight. The stories are legion: drunken tirades, ruined interviews, physical altercations, courtroom appearances, and the kind of self-destruction that was somehow sold as masculinity. His career wasn't just tolerated in spite of this behavior, it was shaped around it. He was marketed as the Hellraiser, the dangerous gentleman, the last of the old-school British rebels. What gets lost in the myth is the cost. Reed's violence and volatility were not harmless footnotes. There were arrests, injuries, and frightened co-stars. Directors learned to pad the schedule. Pubs learned to bolt the furniture down. And yet, time and again, he was given a pass. Why? Because audiences loved the drama even when it wasn't acting. Reed wasn't hiding who he was. He put it front and center. And the industry, rather than recoil, turned it into a brand. In retrospect, it looks less like charm and more like a decades-long marketing campaign built on enabling someone's worst instincts. His death heart failure after a drinking contest during the filming of Gladiator was treated as poetically inevitable, a tragic legend dying in character. But there's no poetry in a life where rage was rehearsed and no one ever called cut. And if Reed's legacy was about unchecked impulse, the next one is about something far more methodical, less violent, more transactional, and quietly unnerving in a completely different way. 16. Benny Hill. Benny Hill made a career out of chasing women around television sets. Literally. His show was a slapstick parade of lowbrow gags, sped-up footage, and perpetual double entendre. It was harmless smut, the critics called it. Boys will be boys, the fans chuckled. For decades, it was a mainstay of British television. But behind the scenes, the man himself was less cartoon than cautionary tale. In recent years, biographical accounts and serious reviews have stripped away the laugh track to reveal something more uncomfortable. Hill wasn't just performing the persona, he was living it, and not in the charming way his defenders like to imagine. According to one major biography, Hill's relationships were less about affection and more about transaction. He was known to offer money or gifts in return for sexual contact, described in some accounts with a tone that teetered between pity and disgust. The details aren't criminal in the legal sense, but they're revealing. There's a bleakness to it. A man who turned every interaction into a negotiation, cloaked in comedic bravado and social awkwardness. It reframes the show itself. What once passed as cheeky becomes, in hindsight, a tightly wound performance of a man who didn't understand boundaries and possibly never wanted to. Hill wasn't just laughing with us. He might have been hiding behind the laughter entirely. The irony, of course, is that for a show so consumed by speed, Benny Hill's personal loneliness moved very slowly. He died mostly alone, reclusive, his routines out of fashion, and his worldview increasingly difficult to explain away as of its time. And if Hill showed what it looked like when transactional behavior wore a comedy mask, the next and final name shows what happens when those inner demons are left unchecked, festering beneath fame until everything collapses. 17. Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock was the master of timing on stage, at least. His dry, twitchy delivery defined a generation of British comedy. Hancock's half-hour turned him into a cultural landmark, a man whose every pause, grimace, and muttered complaint felt like a mirror held up to post-war Britain. He was relatable, miserable, brilliant. He made being discontented into an art form. But behind the scenes, Hancock wasn't just playing the role of a man slowly unraveling. He was living it. The biographies paint a picture of spiraling contradiction. A comedian beloved for his neurosis, slowly losing control of the very emotions that made him famous. Alcoholism was a constant presence. So was the sense that his relationships, romantic, professional, familial, crumbled as fast as his jokes landed. One biographer, summarizing his life, didn't bother with euphemism. Hancock's gift was extraordinary. So was his self-destruction. Accounts of his behavior behind closed doors include erratic moods, emotional cruelty, and frequent bursts of aggression toward those closest to him. His personal relationships suffered under the weight of his instability, and as his career began to stall, so did any pretense of coping. Hancock wasn't just difficult. He was deteriorating, and no one around him seemed able or willing to stop it. The British public loved the persona. The press adored the tragic irony. But the people who lived with him saw something much darker. A man who couldn't outrun his own dissatisfaction, who wore melancholy like a uniform, and who slowly turned his brilliance inward like a weapon. Today, Hancock is often remembered as a cautionary figure, not for scandal in the conventional sense, but for the cost of genius in a world that doesn't know how to protect it. His legacy is a grim final note to this list, one that reminds us that behind the laughter, behind the fame and behind the showbiz polish, there was often pain no one wanted to name. And sometimes, that's the most unsettling part of all.